Who is Labour's approach thus far designed to be for? This is from Amal. She asks, does this voter that Labour seem to have in mind who approves of winter fuel cuts for pensioners and nothing else even exist? George.
So I think they're trying to appeal to voters who want two things. They want a break with the Conservatives, an end to austerity, stronger public services, high living standards. But they also want Labour to be economically responsible. And we've seen past Labour governments get into trouble because they've been seen to mismanage the public finances. So the winter fuel measure that Amal mentions, that was, I think, designed to reassure voters that Labour would have a tight grip on the public finances, also to reassure the markets that because Labour wants to borrow more for investment, to signal to them that they will have a grip on day-to-day spending. I think if you look at some of the measures the government's done there, you could argue they're for quite a traditional Labour audience. Stronger workers' rights, renationalisation of the railways, setting up publicly owned GB Energy, higher taxes on the wealthy. So I think you get a sense there of who they're trying to appeal to. But I think Amal's certainly right that the lack of clear political direction for the government means that the intended target audience has not been as clear as it should be.
So I think one reason why the winter fuel allowance has become totemic of the disaster that Labour has had in the first 100 days. And I don't necessarily think that I think it's a disaster, but that is certainly one perspective on what we've seen. The reason it's become totemic is because they kind of announced that in a vacuum without anything else, without in sort of the context of what they would want to spend the money for. They did it at the same time as settling the pay disputes with junior doctors and train drivers, which from an economic perspective, Rachel Reeves would argue was really, really important because strikes cost the economy billions and settling that pay dispute was sort of vital for economic growth. But it has enabled this narrative that Labour didn't really need to take the money from poor pensioners, although, as I have said, 90% of pensioners receiving the winter fuel allowance don't need it. That's according to the government's own analysis. And without that story of here's what we're doing as a whole and here's how it fits into our missions and here's how it fits into the vision of a better Britain that we want to build, as a standalone policy, it just looked vindictive and it just looked spiteful. In answer to the question of who are they trying to appeal to, lots of analysis before the election was done by Labour showing that being trusted on the economy was necessary. It was crucial if they were going to have any chance of winning the election. They had to show that they were credible on the economy. And then once they had done that, then they could start making the case. At that point, at the point that voters trusted them on the economy, that's the point where voters actually started listening to the other stuff. And I think that has come into the thinking in government and has kind of mutated into the most important thing that voters want from us is to be credible on the economy. No, voters need a government to be credible on the economy, but then they want growth, better public services, higher living standards, all the rest of it. It's not enough to just say we've balanced the budget. And I think there has been a kind of misunderstanding perhaps of what the voter priorities were, and this thing that was necessary but not sufficient has almost become what people see as the Labour government's reason for existing, which is one reason why, as we discussed on yesterday's podcast, they really need to get their political messaging right, which is what the changes in Keir Starmer's team are designed to address.
Do you reckon if they packaged up the winter fuel announcement with what Rachel Reeves is now suggesting we're going to see at the end of the month in the budget, sort of measures that are going to fall on the wealthiest in society, if you like, those who can most afford it, if they packaged it up together, do you think we would have had this furore?
Not as strong, no, because it wouldn't have been such a vacuum. You would have been able to say, everyone, it's shared sacrifice, right? And had you coupled it with the increase in the basic state pension, you could have simply said, look, pensions will be in net terms better off next year, and it wouldn't have been seen in isolation. You could have framed it as a reform rather than a cut, because part of the problem is winter fuel cuts got everyone thinking about austerity, which obviously Rachel Reeves doesn't want them to. I still think the problem with the winter fuel cuts was the quite tough cut-off point as well, where it's only goes to those on pension credit, so that could be those who are on as little as £12,000 a year. Had they gone for a more generous threshold, there may have been less outrage. Of course, it would have raised less money, and Rachel Reeves' argument is you need some in-year savings.
It's not just economics, though, is it? I mean, looking at some of the other things that Labour have chosen to focus on very early on in their term, it's quite striking, isn't it? I mean, assisted dying, we're going to have this private members bill introduced on Monday. We don't know what it's going to be called yet, so therefore what the narrow focus will be.
This is really unfortunate timing for Labour because, as you say, this is a private members bill. This is not something that Keir Starmer's government is bringing forward.
Although he said he supports it.
Well, he said that MPs will get will get a free vote, and members of the government will get a free vote. And as I think is rightly the case, given that it's not a party political issue and it's a very sensitive issue where people want to vote with their conscience. But I think when Labour said that they would allow a free vote on this, they weren't expecting it to arise in Parliament within the first couple of months. I think for people outside the world of politics who don't necessarily understand and why should they the difference between a government bill and a private members bill, it looks very much like Labour is bringing forward this really controversial legislation, and that is in the context of a social care system that is in crisis, a healthcare system that is in crisis, a cost of living crisis more generally, and as Megan Kenyon has written for the New Statesman today, you can't separate the ethics and the morality of assisted dying from the context of a country whose healthcare system is broken. Yeah. And I mean,
Wes Streeting's made that point, hasn't he?
And Ed Davey as well has said that he's very concerned about it. And even people who are sympathetic to the case for assisted dying in the abstract will say you need very, very strong safeguards in place, and you can't really have those safeguards in place if there is a funding crisis in health and in social care and all of these other issues. So the juxtaposition of this private members bill without a kind of more robust offering on some of the deeper seated structural issues in British society is not a good look for Labour.
But I know it's not a government bill, but correct me if I'm wrong, but all the mood music seems to have been anyone in the top 10 who wants to table a bill on assisted dying because we're going to give it some time. I mean, it's okay. It's not a government bill, but it's something that's been supported in inverted commas.
The
if
signal
you like.
I got, if you watch back Keir Starmer's interview with ITV during the general election, where he now famously spoke to Esther Rantzen.
Sorry, I'm sighing because I just find this ridiculous. Oh, it's something I promised Esther Rantzen before the election.
I thought the signal you got there was he was saying, look, lots of MPs from all sides have wanted a vote on this as a matter of conscience for some time. I will be the Prime Minister who gives them the chance to have their say on it. But I agree, the juxtaposition with winter fuel cuts, it lends itself to a lot of negative press coverage and is the kind of thing that you would have thought Downing Street would be keen to avoid if possible.
I don't think there's anything wrong with Labour saying that they would allow a private members bill on this. And as George said, there are MPs from all parties who are pushing for this as the result of getting letters from their constituents who feel very strongly about it. Obviously, there are constituents who also feel very strongly in the opposite direction, and that's why it's really important to have a free vote on it. But I don't see the issue with a government saying this is something that a lot of MPs are agitating for. It's not a party political issue, so we're going to make the parliamentary time and space for it to happen. And I don't think it's fair to characterise that as a Labour policy.
OK, well, let's be more optimistic. We have a question from Lucy, and she says, what should we look forward to? And I think it's something that you've brought up a few times, Rachel, just in the office. Are there things that have happened in these first 100 days which we haven't been discussing, that have gone kind of under the radar?
The big decisions to come around the budget and the spending review, when you will get investment decisions made and ministers will have money to play with. And that will really open up a lot of possibilities, and you'll have a much better sense then of the government's overall economic direction. There were 40 bills in the King's speech, so I think sometimes people underestimate how much existing policy there is, arguably because the government hasn't always communicated it that well. I don't think there's a huge amount that's gone unnoticed. But I talk about this a lot, but I still think the shift on public ownership is significant. It's arguably the first government since the pre-Thatcher era to talk positively about public ownership. We've seen other governments take banks or rail companies into public ownership, but justified as necessary emergency measures rather than as a positive, proactive step. And they're renationalising the railways and they've set up public owned GB Energy. Of course, the big question is, what is public ownership for? What does it actually change in practice? I think that's going to be a challenge. You speak to Louise Haig's team. They are very keen that passengers will feel they're getting a better deal on the railways, that public ownership actually makes a genuine difference. So I think that's another test of Labour is not just can they deliver their manifesto promises, but what's the day-to-day difference that voters, who aren't going to pore over the manifesto, who aren't going to pore over the King's speech, do they feel different in their day-to-day lives? I think that's a good test of Labour.
One thing that I think went completely under the radar as things to do with women's safety really sadly often do is Yvette Cooper has brought in new protections or measures to tackle domestic violence. This is in light of Labour's pledge to halve domestic violence. And one of those is specialist domestic violence experts are listening into 999 emergency calls, and it's based on there's a law called Reeves law, which is based on the really tragic case of a woman who was murdered by her ex-partner along with her mother, who was also murdered, where there had been 13 police calls, and she had called 999 4 times the night of her murder. So it was a really tragic case. But that's something that Yvette Cooper announced in September, pre-conference season. I don't think it got any attention whatsoever. I think we were all talking about freebies and Sue Gray's pay, and that kind of struck me because it's a part of the Home Office that we haven't really talked about that much over the last couple of years. When we've discussed the Home Office, it's generally been in the context of immigration, small boats, and then obviously like the riots and things. But domestic violence obviously falls under that. And I saw that and went, I had completely missed that. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to be talking more about. Not to say that like a Conservative government wouldn't have wanted to do similar. I'm sure they did. But, different governments get sucked into different crises. And obviously immigration was the Conservatives' one. But in terms of what we should be looking forward to, there was an announcement out yesterday from Darren Jones, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, about a 10-year infrastructure and investment review that would include things like schools and school buildings as crucial infrastructure that can drive growth. Now, I think that's pretty obvious. I think if you've got schools where kids can't learn because concrete ceilings are collapsing on their heads, then that's going to have an impact on future productivity and future growth. But just statements like that they're going to think about the problems and the challenges in that context, I think that's pretty positive. I think it'd be pretty positive if we had school buildings that didn't collapse. Maybe that's a really low bar.
Well, it's certainly better. Yes, it's a plus, isn't it?
And also planning reform. Obviously, we haven't got the details on that yet, but I am really, really excited for all of the new houses that are going to be built over this Parliament. And if they are not built, I will be very sad and disappointed.